Hey there, friends. We're going to go ahead and start up on our monster match project. I'm going to show you guys some of the essential pieces that we're going to need inside of here. Now, I've already started off and gotten some of our basics in here. Most people have the array images that we see there, and I do believe that most people also already have their buttons and their div tags at the bottom. So we're going to kind of start off mostly in the JavaScript section. I think we're going to start off with the startGame function and a couple of our global variables as well. First place I'm going to go to, probably the first place that we should always be looking, is actually going to be not my screen recorder, but actually the monster match description. So if I look at this, you guys are going to be in charge of running some of your CSS stuff. I would save this honestly until last, just to make sure everything works on your page. The prime thing that we want to get down is the functionality of it. As long as the page works, then we can start adding some of the CSS styling. Descriptive code comments. Again, this should be something that you guys add on your own, image citations included. I do have a set of monster images. You should be using the ones that we have until you finish the project. Then you can feel free to use some enhancements and add some of your own. But I want to talk about some of this more important stuff, the global variables that we have here. So as a reminder, your global variables are variables that are created inside of the script tags, but they are created also outside of functions. And so these global variables are all loaded into your program when the file starts to begin to run. All the variables that are inside your functions will load once those functions are called. And so the first thing that we look at is it says, can you have two empty arrays representing each player's deck of cards? One thing I've noticed is that students struggle a little bit with naming their arrays, or not their arrays, their variables. With variables, we want to make sure that we name them based on what they're actually holding on to. So I'm going to make some variables that I will call player one deck. I will set it equal to an empty array, very clear that this is the deck of cards for player one. I will also make something called a player two deck, which is going to hold on to all the cards for player two. Next, we will have a variable that is representing each current index that the player has. So each player is going to have this list of cards. We're going to hold on to an initial value in which we say, hey, of this array of 7 items, I have chosen item number 3. Big thing with this is remember that indices start at 0 technically. You will notice it does say do not initialize this value just yet. This will get initialized somewhere later in our program. Again, naming conventions are very big here. So this is something where I might make something called player one index. This is the current index that I'm stuck at. I should make one for also player number 2. Same exact naming convention, keeping it something that we can see, recognize exactly what this thing should be holding on to. The others that we recognize now are the current cards that are selected from the player's one's deck and the player 2 deck. Now the cards themselves are going to be actually the names of some of the monsters. So this is an example of what something like the card will be holding on to. We're going to randomly choose one item from their list. Our list is filled with these strings that kind of look like different, images. These are technically images. So again, this is something that we want to make sure we clearly identify. Player one card might be a great idea for this. And then again, player two card, keeping this very nice and uniform. After that, we need an integer describing the number of cards in our deck. Notice we do initialize this to the value of 8. So each person is going to start with 8 cards. This might be something we name num cards. Go ahead right away, set it to the value of 8. Next up, it says an array containing the file names. I've got those for you guys already at the top here. I happen to name mine an image array. If you wanted to name it monster array or something along those lines, any of those would actually work perfectly fine. The next thing it says an array containing, just talked about that, a string variable containing this game state. So the game state is going to be containing some sort of a word telling me whether the game is paused, whether it's in play mode, or whether it is game over in which somebody has won. So I'm going to make a variable, I'm going to call it game state, and we did ask, as you see here, to initialize it as the game over string. Please make sure that this has quotes around it, so that we recognize that this is going to be some sort of a word or string relative to our computer. After that, I did already enter in the buttons for the new game. I think most people have the buttons for the instructions as well. The table came built into our program, and then we have a divider for the important messages at the bottom. Again, these dividers are very good at just storing things. So my divider right now is going to be completely empty. Same with the divider for the instructions. These things will not be filled until something important happens that we insert messages or insert instructions inside of those. Now it comes down to the JavaScript features themselves. The first thing it asks for is it says, do you have a function that accepts two parameters and can grab you a random integer in between those two arguments? Well, lucky for us, we actually already have this created in our movie trivia file. If you look at this, we have a function right here called random int that takes a minimum and maximum value and returns one number inclusive between those. This is the beauty of computer science, is we can reuse a lot of this code. Well, the only thing we want to make sure is that we keep the comments coming with it as well. Notice you'll see that I have a section here where I'd like you to introduce or post in the random integer function that we have here. So right underneath that comment, without deleting it, I'm going to paste in my random int function. I know this works. We've used it previously, so there's no need to really test this thing out to make sure that it does its job. The next thing that we have, a function that returns a properly formatted image. If I give it an array of file names and an index that I'd like to go to, again, something has already been utilized here in our Marvel trivia. We have a function that's called format image. If you feed me some sort of a list and an index to go to, I will actually create the code for that image to particularly pop up. The file name is just one of the files that we have inside of our list. Again, with this, we are likely going to be taking, keep popping these things up, we're likely going to be taking one of the names of our files in here. But you will see that again, we take this format image function, we paste it right in there as such. So we now have two reused functions that we know work from previous files. The only thing that you might have to change here is what exactly is the name or the folder in which you have saved all of your files. Now, if you take a look at mine over here, I have my monster match sitting right here. I actually have a folder that is called images in which this monster is actually going to show up. So I personally need to change mine to make sure that that matches appropriately. Images was spelled with a lowercase I. I'm going to match the same exact process that we see right here. From here, we now have to move on a little bit more. We say the start function that we have going. This is going to help us kind of update some of the features that we have on our page once we start the actual game. So in this one, it says, when this starts, you're going to reinitialize all relevant variables. Now, the reason for this is at some point in time, we're going to play our game and somebody will win the game, meaning somebody's array will have 16 cards in it while the other person's array will have 0 cards in it. So what we're trying to do is kind of reset and reinitialize all relevant variables for this. Realistically, what we need to look into is we need to say, well, both of my players need to start with an original deck, and I'll eventually have to fill those cards into that thing. Now, something to remind yourselves of with these variables. We have already up top here declared these as variables. Once we write this word var and say that we have something called player 1 deck, we never need to reinitialize this as a variable. It understands that it already does exist. Instead, what we need to do is come down and actually take that and just change or reassign it to be something new. I have something called a player 1 deck. I would like to reassign it to be an empty list. I have something called player 2 deck. I would like to reassign it to be something that is indeed an empty list. Underneath that, it says, why don't you set the game state to be play? Perfect. I have a game state variable. I'm going to make sure that this variable, when I start my game, is in play mode. Set all relevant inner HTML properties as appropriate. So this is where I guess some confusion was happening earlier. Realistically, in my startNewGame function, the only thing that's going to show up is I want the players' names to show up inside those relevant HTML properties. And I also want to make sure that the instructions aren't on the screen if by chance they are there. So this is where I can go ahead and say, well, let's start with the instructions. Let me grab a hold of this divider tag that I have down here. If I by chance turned on the instructions, you'll notice that they don't turn off. So what we're going to do is copy the ID for this, and we're going to grab onto this and just set it and assign it to be something new. Reminders for you, when we grab an element by its ID, we just need to use this documentation.getElementById. That alone grabs the div tag, but once we grab the div tag, we do need to grab what's inside the HTML. difference between value and inner HTML. As a reminder, your inner HTML is the stuff that actually is in between the opening and closing div tag. When things are here, we need to actually, or when things show up here, they will display on our screen themselves. So we just want to replace this so that it kind of empties out and kind of erases the instructions that are on there if they are indeed there. So we will grab the inner HTML. We will set them equal to an empty string going forwards. Write a for loop that takes the correct player's cards and puts them in the deck. This is something we had discussed in class, but again, we can kind of talk about it a little bit more. A for loop that we're going to need to utilize. I'm going to start my I variable at 0, mostly because that is the first index that we have for an array. Some people might try something like this, where we type in we call this a hard-coded value inside of here. This, unfortunately, will work, but is not best practice. Reason for that, if I wanted to decide to change my cards to have 12 cards, I would have to find this line of code in the whole entire program and change any other instance that I've used it. Instead, I have this awesome variable called numCards that is holding on to the idea that we are going to hold 8 cards inside of here. From there, my indices should go up by 1, just like my indices for the array do as well. From here, what we're going to need to do, and this is the difficult part about this, or why modular division or remainder division exists. We have 4 cards, but we need those cards to repeat. And modular division really helps us repeat numbers as a count up kind of occurs. So this I variable is going to go from 0 to 7. And what we want to do is after every 4 numbers, we'd like the zeros to, or we'd like those indices, the valid indices of our monster array or our image array to repeat themselves. To do this, we're going to make a local variable called index. We're going to take my I value, we're going to modularly divide it by 4. This will repeat the values of 0, 1, 2, 3 and 0, 1, 2, 3 for all 8 different values of the I variable that we have. This is then the index that we are going to access inside this image array. We're going to grab index 0, index 1, index 2, index 3, then repeat these again, go backwards through the list one more time. So to start this off, we will go ahead and kind of initialize both players' decks in the same exact loop. To do that, we will grab onto player number 1's deck, and we will push something inside of it. What I will do is I will go to my image array. I will use my hard brackets to go ahead and grab one indice that I want from this. And we will say, hey, that index value is actually the number that I want to grab. It's going to start off at 0, 1, 2, and 3. Again, repeat 0, 1, 2, and 3. What's convenient is we can actually utilize the same exact for loop to fill player 2's deck. Some people have been using 2 different for loops for this. We don't need 2 different for loops. There's, I guess, no downfall to having 2 different ones, but it's more so that you're just repeating code and kind of wasting some lines. Rather, both these players' decks should be identical to each other. So we'll go ahead and get these done here. And then last but not least, it says a call to the function that deals all of our new cards. If you scroll down a tiny bit, you will notice I do have a function here that is called deal new cards. To call a function, you quite literally just need to type the name of that function. So here I'm going to type out deal new cards. Your functions do have the parentheses at the end there, and we have officially finished the start new game function that we have here. I think the only thing I might have forgotten inside of this, I think I mentioned it earlier, I do need the players' names to show up in here. So again, I'm going to grab document.getElementById. I'm going to have to grab the ID for these spans where the player's ID is actually going to show up. This is quite literally just going to be their names. So I scroll up, I say, wherever it is, here it is. I will grab the .inner HTML and I will say, hey, you need to be player number 1. I will repeat this process once again for player number 2. The only difference, the player ID goes to player 2, and I should have the word player 2 show up there.